The summer of 2019 marked my 14th year attending sheriff's camp at Devil's Lake, though I never imagined it would be my last. The name alone should have served as a warning, but at 15 years old, I considered myself too mature for superstitions. The camp stretched along the murky shoreline of a lake so dark it seemed to swallow light itself, surrounded by dense pine forests that blocked out most of the sun even at midday. Our bus groaned to a halt beside the weathered welcome sign, its paint peeling like diseased skin. The other campers filed out with their usual excitement, but something felt different this year. The air hung thick and oppressive, carrying the stench of rotting vegetation from the lake's edge. Even the counselors seemed more subdued than usual, their welcoming smiles forced and brittle. Sheriff Daniels, a grizzled man whose uniform had seen better decades, delivered the standard orientation speech with his trademark stern expression. His weathered face bore new lines of stress, and his eyes kept darting toward the tree line as if expecting something to emerge from the shadows. The rules felt more urgent this year, delivered with an edge that suggested real consequences rather than simple camp protocol. "Stay within designated areas at all times," he barked, his voice carrying across the assembled group. "No wandering after lights out, no exceptions. If you hear anything unusual during the night, alert a counselor immediately. Do not investigate on your own." The emphasis on those final words sent an involuntary shiver through my body, though I attributed it to the unseasonably cool breeze coming off the water. The camp's layout remained unchanged from previous years, yet everything seemed somehow more sinister. The boys' tents clustered near the lake's edge, where the ground remained perpetually damp and gave off an earthy, almost grave-like smell. The girls' cabins sat deeper in the woods, connected by narrow dirt paths that twisted between ancient trees whose branches formed a canopy so thick that even during daylight, the area remained shrouded in perpetual twilight. As we gathered our belongings and began the trek to our assigned cabins, I noticed how the returning campers moved with unusual haste. Their conversations were muted, lacking the boisterous energy typically associated with the first day. Several kept glancing over their shoulders, as if sensing invisible observers in the forest depths. My cabin, number 7, sat at the farthest end of the cluster, isolated from the others by a particularly dense grove of pine trees. The structure itself appeared solid enough, built from rough-hewn logs that had darkened with age and weather. However, the windows seemed oddly positioned, offering views directly into the forest rather than toward the other cabins or the lake. The front door hung slightly crooked on its hinges, creating a gap that would never fully seal out the night air. That evening, as shadows lengthened and merged into the approaching darkness, we gathered around the central fire pit for the traditional welcome ceremony. The flames cast dancing patterns across our faces, creating shifting masks that transformed familiar features into something unsettling. The crackling wood provided the only sound as we settled onto the rough log benches arranged in concentric circles around the fire. Our cabin leader, a college-aged woman named Christina, waited until the last whispers died away before beginning her story. Her voice carried clearly in the still air, but there was a tremor beneath her confident tone that suggested she believed every word she spoke. "Years ago," she began, her eyes reflecting the firelight. "This camp was the site of a tragedy that still echoes through these woods. A young girl named Jennifer, only 13 years old, came here with dreams of adventure and friendship. She was an excellent swimmer, confident in the water, which made what happened all the more shocking." The fire seemed to dim as she spoke, though no wind stirred the air. Around the circle, campers leaned forward, drawn into the narrative despite their better judgment. On her third night here, Jennifer couldn't settle down. She felt restless, confined by the cabin walls. Against all rules, she slipped out after midnight and made her way down to the lake. The water called to her, dark and inviting under the moonless sky. What possessed her to enter that black water alone, we'll never know. Christina paused, allowing the weight of her words to settle over us. In the silence, I could hear the distant lapping of water against the shore, a sound that now seemed ominous rather than soothing. They found her body 3 days later, tangled in the underwater roots near the deepest part of the lake. The strange thing was, There were no signs of struggle, no indication that she had tried to swim back to shore. It was as if something had simply drawn her down into the depths and held her there. A log in the fire collapsed, sending sparks spiraling upward into the darkness. Several campers jumped at the sudden sound, nervous laughter rippling through the group. But death wasn't the end for Jennifer, Christina continued, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. The staff started reporting strange incidents shortly after her funeral. Wet footprints appearing in the cabins despite locked doors. The sound of someone moving through the woods at night, always just beyond the reach of flashlight beams. And some claim to have seen her, walking between the trees in her soaked camp clothes, searching for something she lost in those dark waters. As if summoned by the story, a cool breeze swept through the clearing, causing the fire to flicker and bend. The surrounding forest seemed to press closer, the trees leaning inward like curious spectators. I found myself scanning the tree line, half expecting to see a pale figure emerging from the shadows. They say she's drawn to cabins where young girls stay, Christina concluded, her gaze sweeping across our group. Especially those who remind her of herself. So remember, keep your windows closed and your doors locked. And if you hear tapping on glass in the middle of the night, whatever you do, don't look outside. The story ended, but the atmosphere it created lingered like smoke. As we made our way back to our cabins through the winding forest paths, every snapping twig and rustling leaf seemed magnified. The beam of my flashlight carved a narrow tunnel through the darkness, beyond which anything could be hiding. Our cabin felt smaller once we were all inside, the rough log walls seeming to press inward as 8 girls tried to settle in for the night. The air inside was stale and humid, carrying the lingering scent of previous occupants and something else I couldn't quite identify. Something damp and organic, like wet earth or decaying leaves. Brooke, a slight girl with nervous energy who had claimed the bunk beneath mine, seemed particularly affected by Christina's story. She kept glancing toward the windows, which remained stubbornly dark despite the moon that should have provided some illumination. The glass reflected our interior lights back at us, creating the illusion that we were completely isolated from the outside world. "It's just a story," I assured her as we prepared for bed, though my own voice lacked conviction. "Camp counselors have been telling versions of that tale for decades. It's practically a tradition." But even as I spoke the words, I found myself checking the window latches, ensuring they were properly secured. The gaps around the door frame seemed wider than they had during daylight, creating dark spaces where anything might be watching. The other girls settled into their bunks with unusual quiet, none of the typical first-night chatter that usually kept everyone awake for hours. Ashley, who occupied the bunk across from mine, had pulled her sleeping bag completely over her head, while Emma lay rigidly on her side, staring at the wall. The silence felt unnatural, broken only by the settling sounds of the old building and the distant whisper of wind through the pine needles. I was drifting toward an uneasy rest when Brooke's scream shattered the night. The sound was raw and primal, filled with terror so genuine that it jolted every girl in the cabin instantly awake. She thrashed in her sleeping bag, fighting against something invisible, her voice rising to a pitch that seemed to pierce straight through to my bones. Christina burst through the door within seconds, followed by 2 other counselors carrying flashlights. Their beams swept across the cabin, illuminating our terrified faces in the chaos of disturbed bedding. Brooke continued to struggle, her eyes wide and unfocused, looking at something the rest of us couldn't see. Brooke, you're safe." Christina grabbed the girl's shoulders, shaking her gently but firmly. "It's just a nightmare. You're in your cabin with everyone else." But Brooke's terror didn't diminish. If anything, Christina's touch seemed to intensify her panic. She pointed toward the window nearest her bunk, her hand trembling so violently it was difficult to follow her direction. "The girl!" she gasped, her voice hoarse from screaming. "The girl at the window! She was standing right there, watching us sleep." All eyes turned toward the window she indicated. The glass showed only black emptiness beyond, reflecting our own frightened faces back at us. Christina approached the window cautiously, her flashlight beam cutting through the darkness outside, but the light revealed nothing except the dense wall of trees that pressed close to our cabin. "There's nothing there, sweetheart," Christina said softly, but I noticed how she kept the flashlight trained on the window, as if expecting something to materialize in its beam. Sometimes the first night in a new place can trigger very vivid dreams. Brooke shook her head violently, tears streaming down her face. It wasn't a dream. She had long dark hair and her clothes were soaking wet. Water was dripping from her onto the ground, and she was smiling, but it was wrong. The smile was all wrong. The detailed description sent cold tendrils of fear through my chest. Dreams rarely contained such specific, consistent details. Around the cabin, the other girls huddled deeper into their sleeping bags, as if the thin fabric could provide protection against whatever Brooke had seen. Christina remained with us for another hour, checking and double-checking the window locks, examining the exterior of the cabin with her flashlight, and doing her best to calm our frayed nerves. But when she finally left, the cabin felt more vulnerable than before, as if her presence had been the only thing keeping darker forces at bay. None of us managed more than fitful rest for the remainder of the night. Every sound from outside, the crack of a settling branch, the rustle of leaves, the distant call of a night bird, sent new waves of tension through the cabin. And though I would never admit it to the others, I found myself studying that window whenever sleep began to claim me, half convinced that I would see a pale face pressed against the glass, watching us with that wrong smile Brooke had described. Dawn brought little relief from the night's terror. The morning light filtering through the cabin windows seemed weak and gray, barely penetrating the gloom that had settled over our group. Brooke moved through her morning routine like someone in a trance, her movements mechanical and her eyes constantly scanning the windows as if expecting her midnight visitor to return. As we prepared to head down to breakfast, I noticed Brooke struggling with her camp shirt. The fabric seemed to catch and pull against her back, causing her to wince with each movement. When she reached around to adjust it, her fingers came away with small spots of blood. "Brooke, you're bleeding," I said, moving closer to examine her back. "Did you hurt yourself during the night?" She turned toward me, confusion and growing alarm evident in her expression. "I don't remember hitting anything. It just feels like something's been clawing at my back all night." "Let me see," Ashley offered, moving to help lift Brooke's shirt. What we discovered beneath the fabric made all three of us gasp in horror. Brooke's back was covered with scratch marks, dozens of them, running in parallel lines from her shoulders down to her waist. The marks were too numerous and too evenly spaced to have been self-inflicted during a nightmare. Each scratch was approximately 4 inches long, as if made by fingernails, and they were all oriented in the same direction, as if something had raked its claws down her back repeatedly. "Oh, God," Ashley whispered, her face pale as she studied the marks. "Brooke, what did this to you?" The scratches were fresh, some still seeping small amounts of blood, indicating they had been made recently, certainly during the night while we all slept in the same cabin. The precision and pattern of the marks suggested deliberate intent rather than accidental injury. Brooke twisted to try to see her own back in the small mirror mounted on the cabin wall, but the angle made it impossible. "I felt something during the night," she said slowly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I thought it was part of the nightmare, but there was this sensation of fingers trailing across my skin, cold fingers." The three of us stood in stunned silence, trying to process what we were seeing. The logical part of my mind scrambled for rational explanations. Perhaps she had scratched herself unconsciously, or maybe the rough wooden bunk frame had caused the marks. But the evidence before us defied easy explanation. "We need to show Christina," I said finally, though the words felt inadequate. "How do you explain something that shouldn't be possible?" Ashley nodded grimly. "And maybe the camp nurse. Those cuts need to be cleaned and treated." As we helped Brooke carefully put her shirt back on, I noticed that the scratches extended beneath her clothing, disappearing under the fabric in a way that suggested they covered more of her body than we could see. The thought of something moving through our cabin in the darkness, Methodically marking one of us while the rest slept undisturbed made my stomach churn with revulsion and fear. When we emerged from the cabin, the morning seemed different somehow. The other girls from neighboring cabins were gathering for breakfast, but their conversations were subdued, punctuated by nervous glances toward the forest. Several appeared tired, as if they too had experienced restless nights. "Did you hear anything strange last night?" Emma from Cabin 6 asked as we passed. "We kept hearing sounds outside our windows, like someone walking around the building. But when we looked, there was nothing there." "Footsteps," confirmed another girl. "Wet footsteps, like someone had just come out of the lake." The reports from other cabins sent new waves of unease through our group. Whatever had visited us during the night hadn't limited itself to Cabin 7. The realization that multiple locations had experienced supernatural activity suggested something far more serious than a simple nightmare or isolated incident. As we made our way toward the dining hall, Brooke's condition continued to deteriorate. She moved stiffly, favoring her back, and her face had taken on a grayish pallor that made her look ill. The scratch marks were clearly causing her significant pain, and I began to worry about the possibility of infection. "I can't stay here," she said suddenly, stopping in the middle of the path. "I need to go home. Something is very wrong with this place, and I don't think any of us are safe." Looking at her haunted expression and the evidence of what had been done to her during the night, I found it impossible to argue with her assessment. Whatever force had marked her was clearly capable of more than just leaving scratches, and the thought of what might happen during a second night filled me with dread. By mid-morning, Brooke's parents had arrived to take her home. The sight of the scratch marks had shocked them into immediate action, and they demanded answers that the camp staff couldn't provide. Sheriff Daniels examined the marks personally, his weathered face growing increasingly grim as he studied the precise pattern of the wounds. "These weren't self-inflicted," he concluded grimly. "Something or someone did this deliberately. We're treating this as a potential assault." The word assault sent ripples of fear through the remaining campers. If the authorities considered this a criminal matter, it meant they took the threat seriously. But how do you investigate an assault committed by something that leaves no physical evidence except the marks on its victim? As Brooke's family packed her belongings, she pulled me aside for a final conversation. Her eyes were wide with a fear that went beyond simple concern for her own safety. "Promise me you'll be careful," she whispered urgently. "Whatever did this to me, it's still here. I could feel it watching me all morning, even in daylight. It's not finished with this place." Her words carried a conviction that made my skin crawl. The idea that some malevolent presence remained active during daylight hours had never occurred to me, but Brooke's certainty was unsettling. She had been the primary target so far. Perhaps she had developed some kind of sensitivity to whatever force had marked her. "What did you see at the window?" I asked, needing to understand what we might be facing. "You mentioned details that seemed too specific for a dream." Brooke glanced around to ensure we weren't overheard, then leaned closer. It was a girl, maybe our age, with long dark hair that hung down like wet seaweed. Her skin was so pale it almost glowed in the darkness. But the worst part was her eyes. They were completely black, like pools of lake water. And when she smiled, I could see that some of her teeth were missing, like they had been knocked out. The description made my blood feel thick and cold in my veins. The detail about missing teeth was particularly disturbing. It suggested violence, perhaps connected to the drowning Christina had described around the campfire. She pressed her face against the glass, Brooke continued, her voice growing weaker. Her breath fogged the window, and she used her finger to write something in the condensation. I couldn't read it from inside, but it looked like a name. "What name?" I asked, though part of me didn't want to know. "Jennifer," Brooke whispered. She wrote Jennifer on the window, and then she pointed at me, like she was choosing me for something. The connection to Christina's campfire story was impossible to ignore. Either Brooke's subconscious had incorporated elements from the tale into a vivid nightmare, or something far more disturbing was occurring at the camp. Given the physical evidence of the scratch marks, I found myself leaning toward the latter explanation. After Brooke's departure, the camp felt fundamentally changed. The counselors moved with obvious tension, constantly scanning the tree line and checking on campers more frequently than usual. Several activities were canceled without explanation, and new rules appeared overnight. No one was allowed outside the main areas without direct supervision, and all cabin windows were to remain closed and locked regardless of the heat. Ashley and I found ourselves alone in cabin 7, the absence of our roommates making the space feel larger and more vulnerable. The empty bunks served as constant reminders of what had happened, and I caught myself checking the windows compulsively throughout the day. Maybe we should ask to be moved to a different cabin, Ashley suggested as we prepared for our second night. Somewhere closer to the counselor's quarters. The idea held obvious appeal, but something deeper made me reluctant to abandon cabin 7. Perhaps it was stubborn pride, or maybe a feeling that running away would only delay an inevitable confrontation. Whatever force had targeted Brooke might simply follow us to a new location, and at least here we knew what to expect. "Let's try one more night," I said, though the words felt hollow even as I spoke them. "If anything happens, we'll demand to be moved first thing in the morning." Ashley nodded reluctantly, but I could see the fear in her eyes. Neither of us truly believed we would make it through the night without incident, and the thought of facing whatever had marked Brooke with only the two of us for protection felt like an impossible challenge. As darkness fell over the camp, the forest seemed to press closer to our cabin. The familiar sounds of evening, birds settling for the night, small animals moving through the underbrush, the distant lapping of lake water, were notably absent. The silence felt unnatural, as if the entire ecosystem was holding back, waiting for something to begin. The hours crawled by with excruciating slowness, as Ashley and I lay in our bunks, neither of us able to achieve anything resembling real sleep. Every settling sound from the old building made us tense, and the darkness beyond our windows seemed to pulse with malevolent intent. We had positioned ourselves so that we could monitor all the windows simultaneously, though I questioned what we would actually do if something appeared. Around midnight, the first sign of trouble manifested as a subtle change in the cabin's atmosphere. The air grew noticeably colder, and our breath began to form small clouds in the previously warm space. The temperature drop was so rapid and pronounced that it couldn't be attributed to normal weather patterns. "Do you feel that?" Ashley whispered from her bunk, her voice barely audible. I nodded, pulling my sleeping bag tighter around my shoulders. The cold seemed to seep through the fabric and into my bones, a penetrating chill that no amount of covering could ward off. Worse than the temperature change was the quality of the air itself. It had taken on a thick, oppressive feel, like breathing underwater. Then came the sound we had been dreading, a soft tapping against the window glass. The rhythm was deliberate and patient, 3 taps followed by a pause, then 3 more taps. The sound was too precise to be caused by wind-blown debris, and too persistent to be coincidental. Ashley and I exchanged terrified glances, neither of us willing to look toward the window where the tapping originated. The sound continued for several minutes, maintaining its measured rhythm, as if whatever was making it knew we were awake and listening. "Should we call for Christina?" Ashley mouthed silently. Before I could respond, the tapping stopped abruptly, leaving us in a silence that felt somehow more threatening than the sound itself. In the quiet, I became aware of another noise, a wet, dragging sound, like something being pulled across the ground outside our cabin. The dragging sound circled our building slowly, pausing at each window before moving on to the next. Whatever was making the noise seemed to be conducting a methodical inspection of our cabin, searching for the optimal point of entry. The thought of something testing our defenses while we lay helpless inside made my heart race with panic. When the dragging sound reached the window beside my bunk, I caught a glimpse of movement in my peripheral vision. Against every instinct screaming at me to hide, I turned my head slightly and saw a shadow passing by the glass. The shape was human in general outline but wrong in its proportions. Too tall and thin, with limbs that moved in unnatural ways. The shadow paused directly outside my window, and I had the terrifying sensation that it was studying me through the glass. Though I couldn't make out any features, I felt the weight of its attention like a physical pressure. My entire body went rigid with fear, and I found myself unable to move or even breathe properly. Then, with deliberate slowness, something began tracing patterns on the window glass. The sound was unmistakable, fingernails dragging across the surface, creating designs that I couldn't see but could hear with perfect clarity. The patterns were complex and purposeful, suggesting intelligence behind the actions rather than random scratching. Ashley had buried her head completely under her sleeping bag, her entire body trembling with fear. I wanted to follow her example, but something kept my eyes fixed on the window where the scratching continued. The patterns seemed to be building toward something, growing more elaborate and urgent with each passing moment. Suddenly, the scratching stopped, and a new sound filled the cabin. Breathing. Slow, deliberate breathing that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The sound was wrong somehow, too wet and labored, like someone trying to breathe through water. Each exhale created a slight fogging on the window glass, confirming that something was indeed pressed against the outside surface. In the condensation created by that unnatural breathing, letters began to appear. Slowly, deliberately, as if written by an invisible finger, a message formed on the glass. "Let me in." The words hung there in the foggy condensation, clearly visible even in the darkness. They were written in a shaky, uneven script that suggested great effort or distress. Below the first message, more words appeared. "So cold." My rational mind struggled to process what I was seeing. Condensation doesn't form letters on its own, and the temperature differential required to create fog on glass should have been impossible given the current weather conditions. Yet the evidence was right there before me, undeniable and terrifying. The messages continued to appear. "Help me. Please. So alone." Each new word sent fresh waves of terror through my body. But beneath the fear, I began to feel something else. A strange, inappropriate sympathy. The messages seemed desperate rather than threatening, suggesting someone in genuine distress rather than a malevolent entity seeking to cause harm. That moment of sympathy nearly proved disastrous. Without conscious thought, I found myself moving toward the window, drawn by an inexplicable urge to respond to the pleas for help. My hand actually reached for the window latch before Ashley's terrified voice snapped me back to reality. "Don't!" she hissed from beneath her sleeping bag. "Remember what happened to Brooke." The reminder of Brooke's scratch marks shattered whatever influence had been pulling me toward the window. I jerked my hand back and stumbled away from the glass, my heart pounding with the realization of how close I had come to making a potentially fatal mistake. The breathing outside continued for several more minutes before gradually fading away. The messages on the window remained visible until the condensation naturally evaporated, leaving behind only normal glass that reflected our terrified faces back at us. We spent the rest of the night huddled together in the center of the cabin, as far from all windows as possible, waiting for dawn to release us from our vigil. Neither of us spoke about what we had experienced, as if putting it into words might somehow make it more real or powerful. When morning finally arrived, we discovered something that made our blood freeze: wet footprints on the ground outside our cabin, circling the building exactly as we had heard during the night. The prints were roughly human-shaped, but wrong in their proportions, too long and narrow, with what appeared to be claw marks at the ends where toes should have been. The discovery of the footprints prompted an immediate investigation by camp authorities, though their efforts yielded more questions than answers. Sheriff Daniels brought in additional personnel, including a crime scene photographer who documented the prints before they could be disturbed by foot traffic or weather. The prints told a disturbing story. They began at the lake's edge, suggesting whatever had made them had emerged directly from the water. The trail led up through the forest to our cabin, where they circled the building multiple times before returning toward the lake. Most unsettling was the fact that the prints showed no signs of the natural deterioration that should have occurred overnight. They remained sharp and clear, as if they had been made moments before discovery. "I've never seen anything like these," admitted Dr. Patterson, a local expert in wildlife tracking who had been called in to analyze the prints. "They're humanoid in general shape, but the proportions are all wrong. The stride length suggests someone at least 7 feet tall, but the width indicates an impossibly narrow build." The measurements confirmed what Ashley and I had observed. Whatever had visited us was not entirely human, at least not in any conventional sense. The revelation sent new waves of panic through the remaining campers, and several more families arrived throughout the day to collect their children. Emma, who had been maintaining her composure better than most, finally approached us with information that explained her growing anxiety. She had been keeping secrets about her own encounters, hoping they would simply stop if she ignored them. "I've been seeing things," she admitted quietly as the three of us sat by the lake, far from listening ears. "Ever since the first night. But I didn't want to end up like Brooke, so I kept quiet." "What kind of things?" I asked, though I dreaded the answer. Emma glanced around nervously before responding. "Rainbow boots. I know it sounds ridiculous, but I keep seeing these old-fashioned rubber boots. You know, the kind with rainbow stripes that kids wear. They appear outside my cabin window every night, just standing there in the grass like someone invisible is wearing them." The detail was so specific and unusual that it had to be genuine. No one would fabricate such an odd element for a made-up story. The rainbow boots suggested something connected to childhood, perhaps another victim of the lake's dark history. "There's more," Emma continued, her voice growing weaker. "Sometimes I hear children singing, but the melody is wrong, like they're trying to remember a song but getting the notes mixed up. And yesterday, when I was walking back from the dining hall, I found these." She reached into her pocket and pulled out a handful of small objects, children's toys, the kind that might have been lost or forgotten decades ago. There was a small plastic doll with matted hair, a miniature car with most of its paint worn away, and a whistle that looked like it had spent years underwater. "I found them arranged in a circle outside my cabin," Emma explained, "placed too deliberately to have been dropped accidentally. It was like someone was leaving me presents, but they were all damaged, all wrong." The toys felt cold to the touch, and they carried a faint smell of lake water and decay. Examining them more closely, I noticed that each item showed signs of prolonged submersion, the kind of damage that comes from spending years underwater before washing up on shore. "We need to tell the counselors," Ashley said firmly. "This is getting worse, not better. More girls are being targeted, and whatever this thing is, it's becoming bolder." But even as she spoke, I noticed Emma's expression changing. Her eyes had taken on a distant, unfocused quality, and her head tilted to one side as if listening to something the rest of us couldn't hear. When she spoke again, her voice carried an odd, flat tone that didn't match her usual manner of speaking. "Something terrible is going to happen," she said, her words coming slowly and deliberately. "Very soon. The water is rising, and the lost ones are coming home." The prediction sent ice through my veins, not just because of its ominous content, but because of the way Emma delivered it. Her voice had dropped to a deeper register, taking on qualities that didn't seem to belong to a 15-year-old girl. The transformation was subtle but unmistakable, reminiscent of Brooke's description of her midnight visitor. "Emma?" Ashley said tentatively, waving her hand in front of our friend's face. "Emma, are you okay?" For several long seconds, Emma remained motionless, staring out across the dark water with that strange, distant expression. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the episode ended. She blinked rapidly, shook her head, and looked at us with confusion. "What happened?" she asked, her voice returning to its normal tone. "Why are you both staring at me like that?" Ashley and I exchanged worried glances. Emma's warning had carried the same prophetic quality as her earlier prediction about my family's tragedy, suggesting that whatever force was influencing her had access to information beyond normal human perception. "You made a prediction," I said carefully, "about something terrible happening soon. Emma's face paled as she processed my words. I don't remember saying anything. The last thing I recall was showing you the toys, and then nothing. It's like I lost a few minutes. The realization that she had no memory of her prophetic statements was perhaps more frightening than the predictions themselves. It suggested that whatever entity was using her as a conduit was becoming stronger, able to override her consciousness completely rather than simply influencing her thoughts. As we sat there contemplating the implications of Emma's condition, a commotion erupted from the direction of the camp buildings. Shouting voices carried across the water, followed by the sound of running footsteps. The three of us rushed back toward the cabins, where we found counselors and campers gathered around the camp's main bulletin board. Someone had left a message during the broad daylight, written in what appeared to be mud or algae from the lake bottom. The letters were large and crude, clearly visible from a distance. Tonight we come home. Below the message, arranged in neat rows, were dozens of personal items that had obviously been collected from various cabins: hair ties, jewelry, small photographs, even pieces of clothing. Each item was coated with the same dark substance as the message, and they gave off the unmistakable smell of stagnant water and decay. The implications were clear. Whatever forces were at work had unlimited access to our living spaces, despite locked doors and constant supervision. They could enter and exit at will, taking whatever they wanted as trophies or warnings. Most disturbing of all, the message suggested that tonight would bring a final confrontation, an event that would eclipse everything that had happened so far. As darkness approached, the atmosphere at camp reached a breaking point. Sheriff Daniels had called in additional law enforcement, and the state police had established a perimeter around the entire facility. Floodlights were brought in to illuminate the forest surrounding the cabins, though their harsh beams seemed to create more shadows than they eliminated. Most of the remaining campers had been moved to the dining hall, where they could be monitored constantly by multiple adults. However, a few of us, those who had been most directly involved in the supernatural encounters, were kept in our original cabins under the theory that we might serve as early warning systems for whatever was coming. Ashley, Emma, and I found ourselves alone in Cabin 7 once again, though this time we were supposedly protected by electronic monitoring equipment and guards positioned around the perimeter. The presence of additional security provided little comfort, as we all understood that conventional measures had proven useless against whatever force we were facing. Emma's condition had deteriorated throughout the afternoon. She spoke in fragments, responding to conversations that only she could hear, and her eyes rarely focused on anything in the present moment. Several times, she had attempted to walk toward the lake before being gently redirected by the counselors monitoring us. "They're calling to me," she said during one of her more lucid moments. "All the children who went into the water and never came back. They want me to join them." The revelation that there had been multiple drowning victims over the years added a new dimension to our situation. Perhaps Jennifer was not the only restless spirit haunting the camp. The lake might be holding dozens of lost souls, all seeking to reclaim what they had left behind in the world of the living. As night fell, the electronic monitoring equipment began malfunctioning. Sensors designed to detect movement showed constant motion where nothing was visible, and thermal cameras picked up cold spots that moved through the forest with apparent intelligence. The guards' radios filled with static whenever they tried to communicate, and their flashlights flickered unpredictably despite fresh batteries. The first sign of supernatural activity came as a change in the water itself. Through our cabin windows, we could see the lake's surface beginning to glow with a faint phosphorescent light. The illumination wasn't reflected from any external source. It seemed to emanate from deep within the water, as if something massive was rising from the depths. "Look at the shore," Ashley whispered, pointing toward the water's edge. Dark figures were emerging from the lake, moving with the slow, deliberate pace of those long accustomed to underwater existence. They appeared to be children or young teenagers, but their movements were wrong, too fluid, too coordinated, like a school of fish rather than individual beings. As they reached dry land, the figures became more distinct. Each one bore the unmistakable signs of drowning: pale skin with a blue-gray tint, hair that hung in wet tangles, and clothing that clung to their bodies like burial shrouds. They moved in perfect silence, creating no sound despite their obvious weight and substance. We need to get out of here, I said, backing away from the window. This isn't something we can handle. But when I turned toward the door, I found Emma standing directly in my path. Her eyes were completely black now, reflecting the phosphorescent glow from the lake, and when she smiled, I could see that some of her teeth had become loose and discolored. Too late, she said in a voice that carried the sound of rushing water. They've been waiting so long and now they're home. The transformation in Emma was complete now. Whatever entity had been influencing her had taken full control. She no longer moved like a living person, but with the same fluid, unnatural grace as the figures emerging from the lake. Ashley grabbed my arm, pulling me toward the back window of the cabin. "We have to run," she hissed. "Emma's gone. That's not her anymore." But as we reached the window, we discovered that escape was impossible. The dark figures had surrounded our cabin completely, standing in perfect circles like sentinels. Their black eyes reflected the cabin's interior lights, creating the illusion of dozens of small fires burning in the darkness. "Why are they just standing there?" Ashley whispered. The answer came from Emma, though her voice now carried harmonics that suggested multiple speakers. "They're waiting for an invitation. The living must choose to join the drowned. It's always been that way." The realization hit me with devastating clarity. This had never been about random supernatural attacks. The scratch marks on Brooke, the prophetic warnings, even the personal items taken from our cabins. Everything had been designed to create fear and desperation, to drive us toward a single moment of choice. "You want us to come willingly," I said, understanding flooding through me. "That's why you haven't simply taken us. You need us to choose." Emma's transformed features arranged themselves into an expression of terrible joy. "The lake is so lonely. So many friends waiting in the dark water, and so few new companions to join them. But you understand now. You can see how beautiful it would be, floating forever in the cool darkness, never aging, never dying, never alone." The offer carried a seductive quality that I found difficult to resist. The idea of escaping all future pain and uncertainty, of joining a community of eternal children in the peaceful depths, held an appeal that transcended rational thought. Ashley's grip on my arm tightened, her fingernails digging into my skin hard enough to draw blood. The sharp pain cut through the supernatural influence, allowing me to think clearly for a moment. "No," I said firmly, as much to convince myself as to reject the offer. "We're not going with you." Emma's expression shifted to one of profound sadness, though the alien intelligence behind her eyes remained unchanged. "Then you'll have to watch everyone else make that choice, one by one, until you're the only one left. And eventually, the loneliness will bring you to us anyway." The sound of breaking glass from the direction of the dining hall confirmed that the supernatural assault had begun in earnest. Screams and shouts carried through the night air, suggesting that our situation was not unique. The entire camp was under siege by forces that conventional defenses could not stop. Through our cabin windows, we could see other figures emerging from the forest. Not the drowned children from the lake, but older presences that moved with ancient authority. These beings appeared to be the original inhabitants of the area, spirits that had been tied to this land long before the camp was built. "The indigenous people warned against building here," Emma said, her voice now carrying the whisper of wind through ancient trees. "They knew this was a crossing place, where the living and the dead share the same space. But the builders didn't listen, and now the boundary has worn thin." The revelation added context to our supernatural encounters, but it provided no comfort. If anything, the knowledge that we were dealing with multiple layers of spiritual activity made our situation seem more hopeless. As dawn approached, the intensity of the supernatural activity began to diminish. The figures around our cabin slowly retreated toward the lake, moving with the same eerie coordination they had displayed upon arrival. Emma collapsed as whatever had been controlling her finally released its hold, leaving her unconscious but apparently unharmed. By morning, half the camp had been evacuated to local hospitals for treatment of various psychological traumas. The official reports would blame mass hysteria and contaminated water supplies, but those of us who had witnessed the truth knew better. I left sheriff's camp that morning with the knowledge that some places are inherently wrong, that the boundary between life and death is thinner in certain locations than we care to admit. But I also carried something else. A terrible certainty that my connection to that place was not finished. Emma's final prediction, delivered in her own voice as consciousness returned, haunts me still. You'll be back. Maybe not this year or even the next, but the lake remembers you now. And what the lake remembers, it eventually claims. 3 months later, as I write this account, I learned that my childhood dog and her entire litter had died without explanation, exactly as the transformed Emma had predicted during our bus ride home. The connection between my camp experience and the tragedy at home can't be proven, but the timing was too precise to be coincidental. Sheriff's camp closed permanently after that summer, though the official reasons cited budget constraints rather than supernatural activity. The cabins now stand empty, slowly being reclaimed by the forest that surrounds them. But sometimes, according to local reports, phosphorescent lights can still be seen beneath the surface of Devil's Lake, and children's voices carry across the water on windless nights. I've never returned to that place, though the urge to do so grows stronger with each passing year. The lake calls to me in dreams, showing me visions of peace and eternal friendship in its dark depths. Each time I resist the invitation, but I can feel my resolve weakening. Emma was right. The lake remembers me now. And someday, when the loneliness becomes too much to bear, I fear I may finally answer its call. The dense forest closed in around me as I hiked deeper into the heart of the Michigan wilderness, my boots crunching through the thick carpet of fallen leaves and pine needles. I adjusted the heavy pack on my back, feeling the weight of the survival gear and supplies I'd need for this secret mission. When I first got the cryptic message about this off-the-books government job, I was desperate enough to take it without asking too many questions. Money had been tight ever since I got out of the Army. This gig promised a big payday if I could track down and retrieve some classified material that had gone missing in these remote woods. They needed someone with my background in reconnaissance and survival. But now, miles from civilization, an uneasy feeling prickled the back of my neck, like I was being watched by unseen eyes in the shadows of the towering evergreens. I quickened my pace, wanting to make camp before nightfall. As a kid growing up in Milwaukee, I'd heard all the old stories and folklore about strange things that lived in the ancient forests of the upper Midwest. Things that didn't appreciate humans intruding in their domain. I shook my head, trying to dispel the irrational fears. I was a trained professional, not some gullible bumpkin spooked by tall tales. Still, I couldn't quite shake the sense that I wasn't alone out here, that I was an intruder who wasn't welcome. The sun dipped below the horizon, the forest rapidly darkening beneath the dense canopy. I needed to stop for the night. I found a small clearing and unslung my pack, pulling out my tent and survival stove. As I set up camp, I reviewed the mission brief in my head. Somewhere in this sprawling wilderness, a government field team had gone radio silent while transporting a package marked maximum classified. My job was to locate any survivors and secure that package, contents unknown. I didn't like operating without all the facts, but I needed this job. The pay would get me back on my feet, let me breathe a little easier. I finished setting up my modest camp and heated up an MRE for dinner. As I sat by the small fire, the night pressed in close, a living darkness that felt heavy with secrets. The normal sounds of nature, the hooting owls and chirping crickets, seemed muted, like the forest itself was holding its breath. Suddenly a twig snapped in the underbrush, freakishly loud in the oppressive silence. I jumped to my feet, pulling my sidearm from its holster, my heart pounding. I peered into the inky shadows between the trees but saw nothing. "Hello? Is someone there?" I called out. No response, just that same weighted silence. I knew I should put out the fire, take cover in my tent. But some reckless part of me, the part that had spent too long in war zones, needed to know what was out there. I grabbed a flashlight and slowly approached the tree line. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, catching strange shapes in its stark illumination. Gnarled tree trunks that looked almost human. Moss-covered boulders crouched like sleeping beasts. There was nothing there, I told myself. Just an overactive imagination. I was about to turn back to camp when the light landed on something that made my blood turn to ice water in my veins. There, in the leaf litter just beyond the edge of my camp, was a single pristine military boot, laces tied, no sign of the foot that belonged in it. The boot was upright, standing on its sole, defying gravity, as if it had been deliberately placed there and was waiting for its owner to return. A cold sweat broken out across my forehead despite the chill in the autumn air. This was all wrong. Something was very wrong with this forest. With a rising sense of dread, I began to wonder if the local folklore I'd scoffed at was more than just stories, and if I had walked into something I didn't understand. I suddenly wondered if the missing government team had run afoul of something best left undisturbed in these ancient woods. And now I was alone out here with it. I barely slept that night, startling awake at every noise in the darkened forest around me. The waiting boot haunted my thoughts. It had to be connected to the missing team I was sent to find. But how? And why leave it there like some kind of unsettling message? At first light, I broke camp, desperate to complete my mission and get out of these eerie woods. I hiked in the direction the boot had been pointing, a strange hunch telling me it was a clue. As I trekked deeper into the wilderness, the sense of being watched only intensified. I caught flickers of movement in my peripheral vision. But when I turned to look, there was never anything there. Just the endless green of the forest and the sound of my own labored breathing. Around midday, I stumbled into another clearing and stopped short. There, arranged in a perfect circle, were a dozen more boots, all in the same pristine condition, standing on their soles like strange monuments. My heart raced as I approached the circle. Each boot was a different size and style, from combat boots to hiking shoes. Did they represent the missing team? There were men's and women's shoes. Had the whole unit disappeared? I searched the clearing for any other clues, but found nothing. No sign of a struggle, no discarded gear, just those damn boots standing sentinel. I pulled out my satellite phone, ready to report this unsettling discovery, but I had no signal. Of course. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my nerves. I was a rational man. There had to be a logical explanation. Maybe the team had to abandon their boots for some reason. Maybe this was all part of some training exercise and I was getting worked up over nothing. But deep down, I knew something far stranger was at work. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled with the certainty that I was dealing with something beyond my understanding. Something that belonged to the world of myth and folklore, not military secrets. I had to keep moving, complete my objective. I left the clearing and the uncanny boot circle behind, pushing further into the forest. The trees grew older, taller, their canopy blocking out more and more of the sunlight until I felt like I was walking through an eternal twilight. I consulted my map and compass, making sure I was still on course. As I looked back up from the map, I froze. There, in the middle of the game trail ahead of me, was a single combat boot lying on its side, as if it had been tossed there carelessly by its vanished owner. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, to get out of this forest. But I had a mission. Slowly, I approached the boot. I had to know if it held any answers. I crouched down, my hand trembling slightly as I reached for the boot. Just before my fingers touched the leather, the boot moved. It rocked slightly, then flipped itself upright as if yanked by an invisible string, making me scramble back with a yelp of shock. The boot began to march forward of its own accord, heading deeper into the woods. It was impossible. It defied everything I knew about the world. But here I was, watching a lone boot stride purposefully into the forest. Some crazy impulse seized me and I found myself following after the boot, my heart hammering in my chest. I kept a safe distance but matched its pace, letting it lead me to who knew where. As I trailed the uncanny boot through the shadowed woods, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being led into the heart of something ancient and powerful, a force that had lured countless men and women into its domain over the centuries, never to be seen again. And now I was to be the latest sacrifice to its hungry isolation. As I followed the marching boot deeper into the forest, my mind reeled, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Every rational part of me insisted this was impossible. Boots don't move on their own. There had to be some trick, some clever bit of stagecraft designed to unsettle me. But another part of me, the part that had heard all those old legends growing up, whispered that there were things in this world that defied rational explanations. Ancient things, powerful things, that modern man had forgotten but still lurked in the wild places of the earth. The boot continued its relentless forward motion, never faltering, never slowing. It moved with a purpose, as if called by some unseen force. I followed, arms slick with fierce sweat despite the autumn chill, breath coming in shallow gasps. What was I doing? Why didn't I turn around, go back the way I came? But I knew I couldn't. Not without answers. Not without finding out what happened to the team I was sent to locate. Their fate was tied to this impossible boot, I was certain of it. So I pressed on, tracking the boot as the forest grew darker and more twisted around us. The trees here were ancient, their trunks gnarled and deformed, branches twisting into unnatural shapes. They seemed to lean in towards the narrow game trail, blocking out the sky, trapping me in a claustrophobic tunnel of wood and shadow. I thought back to the old stories I'd heard as a kid, tales passed down from my grandfather who'd been a logger in the North Woods. Stories of men who ventured too deep into the forest and came back changed, if they came back at all. Men who claimed to have seen impossible creatures, who spoke of trees that moved when you weren't looking and strange lights that danced in the night sky. As a child, I'd thrilled to those stories, begging my grandfather to tell them again and again. But as I grew older, I dismissed them as simple folklore, the product of isolation and overactive imaginations. Now, following a boot marching itself through a darkened forest, those stories didn't seem so fanciful anymore. The boot suddenly veered off the game trail, heading into the thick underbrush. I hesitated, looking at the dense wall of foliage, but I knew I had to follow. I couldn't lose the boot, not when it was my only lead. I pushed through the brush, thorns catching at my clothes, branches slapping my face. The boot was just ahead, moving easily through the tangled growth, as if the forest itself was parting to let it pass. I stumbled out into another clearing and pulled up short. The boot had stopped in the center of the open space. As I watched, it began to move in a slow circle, as if pacing out the dimensions of the clearing. Then, to my horror, more boots began to emerge from the trees ringing the clearing. Dozens of them, all marching on their own, all converging on the clearing like some grotesque gathering. They formed a ring around the perimeter, a macabre audience waiting for some unholy show to begin. In the center, the first boot was joined by a second, then a third. They began to move together, marching in intricate patterns, their steps forming strange sigils on the forest floor. I watched, my breath caught in my throat, as the boots danced their eerie ballet. It was hypnotic, mesmerizing, the rhythmic thump of their steps echoing in the unnatural silence of the forest. Some distant, rational part of me screamed that I should run, that I should flee this impossible scene. But I was rooted to the spot, transfixed by the boot's macabre performance. Then, as suddenly as it began, the dance stopped. The boots were once again standing in a perfect circle in the clearing's center. And in that moment of stillness, I saw something that turned my blood to ice. In the center of the circle, the earth was moving, stirring as if something were pushing up from beneath, fighting its way out of the soil. The leaves and dirt shifted, then parted as a hand burst forth from the ground, pale and caked with grave soil, but unmistakably human. A scream lodged in my throat as I watched a figure claw its way out of the forest floor, sloughing off dirt, rising to stand in the center of the ring of boots. It was dressed in the tattered remains of a military uniform, its skin pale and gray. As the figure turned towards me, I saw its face was a ruin, features rotted away, eye sockets dark and hollow. But I recognized the name patch on its chest. It belonged to the commander of the missing unit I'd been sent to find. The thing that had once been a man opened its mouth and a sound emerged, a guttural moan that held an age of sorrow and hunger. And as that terrible sound echoed through the clearing, the boots began to move again, marching towards me with unholy purpose. As the reanimated corpse of the unit's commander lurched towards me, I finally broke free of my paralysis. Blind panic overtook me, and I turned to run, crashing through the underbrush in a desperate bid to escape the nightmarish scene behind me. Branches tore at my face and arms as I ran, but I barely felt them. All I could focus on was putting as much distance as possible between myself and that thing in the clearing, my commander returned from the dead. But even as I fled, my mind reeled, trying to process what I had seen. The marching boots, the resurrected corpse. It defied all reason, all laws of nature. How was this possible? What dark power could reanimate the dead, could control inanimate objects like macabre puppets? I thought back to the old stories, tales of creatures that could shape reality to their whims, blur the line between life and death. Beings older than humanity, powerful and inscrutable. Had the missing unit stumbled across such an entity? As I ran, I reviewed what I knew, trying to piece together a complete picture. The unit had been transporting classified material. Had that been some artifact, some relic tied to these ancient beings? Had they awakened something that should have stayed buried? My lungs burned and my legs ached, but I pushed on, driven by a primal need to escape, to survive. Behind me I could hear the sounds of pursuit, the relentless marching of many feet. But it wasn't just the undead commander chasing me. To my horror, I realized it was the boots, the entire uncanny army of them, and they were gaining ground. I spotted a light ahead through the trees, a campfire. Hope flared in my chest, a ranger station, another hiker, someone who could help. I put on a burst of speed, crashing through the last of the underbrush into a small clearing. But the hope died as quickly as it had risen. The clearing was empty save for a single tent and a dying campfire. No, not quite empty. Arrayed around the campfire like some obscene audience were boots, dozens of them, waiting. I skidded to a halt, my heart in my throat. I was surrounded, the boots closing in from all sides. There was nowhere left to run. As the undead commander and his army of boots emerged from the trees, I truly understood the depths of the horror I was facing. This was no mere monster, no simple undead creature. This was something far older, far more powerful, a force that could bend the laws of life and death, of reality itself. I had stumbled into its domain, trespassed where humans were not meant to walk. And now, like countless others before me lured into these ancient woods, I would pay the price. The commander's corpse shuffled closer, its movements jerky and unnatural. Up close, I could see the rot, the exposed bones, the empty sockets where eyes once sat. It reached for me with skeletal hands, and I knew my fate was sealed. As the boots closed in, as cold, dead fingers brushed my face, a scream finally tore loose from my throat, echoing through the forest. But there was no one to hear it. No one to help. In that moment, as the commander's corpse pulled me into its embrace and the boots began to march once more, I finally understood the true nature of the ancient power in this forest. It was a hunger, a need to consume, to subsume all life into its eternal, soulless dance. And I was to be its latest meal, my life, my very essence, fuel for its endless, uncanny performance in the depths of these primordial woods. The last thing I saw as the boots marched over me, burying me in their relentless rhythm, was the night sky above the clearing, stars cold and distant. So beautiful, so unreachable. Then the boots closed over my head, and I knew no more, just the endless sound of marching, marching, marching into oblivion. Darkness. Utter, complete darkness. That was all I knew, all I could comprehend. Was this death? Was this what lay beyond that final veil? Just an eternity of black? But no. Death would be a mercy, a release. And as sensation slowly returned to me, I knew I had not been granted that mercy. I could feel the cold earth beneath me, the damp soil pressing in on all sides. I was underground, buried, but still somehow, impossibly, alive. Panic seized me and I thrashed, trying to claw my way out of my earthen prison. But the soil was packed tight, unyielding. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. I was trapped, entombed in the very earth itself. Just as I felt the last of my air expelled from my lungs, just as I was sure I would finally succumb, I felt it. A presence, ancient and powerful, all around me. It was in the soil, in the roots that twined around my limbs, in the very worms that crawled through the dirt. And it was in me. I could feel it seeping into my skin, my muscles, my bones. It was a force of nature, primordial and uncaring, and it was claiming me, making me part of itself. With that realization came understanding. The boots, the undead commander, they were mere expressions of this force, vessels for its power. It was the forest itself, a living, sentient thing, older than humanity, older than thought. I had not been buried, I had been planted. Like a seed, I was being nourished, grown, transformed into something new, something that was no longer entirely human. The presence invaded my mind, my memories. I saw flashes of the countless others who had been taken by the forest over the centuries, hikers, explorers, soldiers, all subsumed into its eternal being. I saw the role I was to play, the purpose for which I had been chosen. I was to be its agent, its emissary. I would walk again, not as a man, but as an extension of the forest's will. I would lure others into its embrace, feed its endless hunger, just as I had been lured. As this terrible knowledge filled me, I felt my body changing, warping to the forest's design. My skin hardened, grew bark-like. My fingers elongated into twisting roots. I could feel the sap running through my veins, the slow, inexorable pulse of the forest itself. And then, with a shuddering gasp, I was rising, clawing my way out of the earth, born anew. I stood, shakily, unused to my new form. I was taller, stronger, no longer constrained by the limits of mere human flesh. Around me, the forest whispered its welcome, its approval. I was one with it now, a child of root and soil. The last vestiges of my humanity had been stripped away, replaced by something ancient, something green and growing. I looked down at my hands, seeing the rough, bark-like skin, the elongated fingers. I flexed them, marveling at the strength, the power that flowed through me, the power of the forest itself. In the distance, through the trees, I could see a campfire, smell the sweet scent of human flesh. The forest's hunger, my hunger, stirred. It was time to feed. I took a step forward, then another. The boots, my loyal soldiers, fell in behind me, marching to the forest's implacable rhythm. I had work to do, and all of eternity to do it in. The forest had claimed me, and through me, it would claim others. Such was the cycle, older than time itself. The forest would always hunger, and I, its faithful servant, would always provide. I moved through the forest, my steps silent on the loam, leaving no trace of my passage. The trees whispered to me, guiding me towards my prey. I could feel their presence, the warm flicker of their lives, like candles in the dark. So fragile, so easily extinguished. As I approached the campsite, I could hear their voices, the soft murmur of conversation. They were oblivious, unaware of the fate that awaited them. Just as I had once been. I remembered my own journey into these woods, the mission that had brought me here. It seemed like a lifetime ago, a memory belonging to someone else, someone human. That man had died the moment the forest claimed him, buried him in its damp embrace. Now I was something new, something that walked between the world of men and the realm of root and soil. I was the forest's emissary, its lure and its maw. Through me, it would feed, as it had for eons. I emerged from the trees, stepping into the flickering light of the campfire. There were 3 of them, 2 men and a woman, all wearing the uniform of the Ranger Service. They looked up as I approached, their eyes widening in surprise and alarm. I knew what they saw. A figure tall and gaunt, clad in the tattered remnants of a military uniform. A face that was no longer entirely human, skin rough and bark-like, eyes as green and deep as the forest itself. What are you?" one of the men stammered, reaching for the rifle propped against a log. I smiled, and it was the smile of the forest, ancient and hungry. "I am the end," I said, my voice rustling like wind through leaves. "And the beginning. I am the cycle, eternal and unchanging." Behind me, the boots emerged from the darkness, marching in perfect unison. They formed a circle around the campsite, trapping the Rangers inside. There would be no escape, no mercy. The Rangers stared in horror at the spectral army, their faces pale in the firelight. They didn't understand, couldn't comprehend the power they faced. To them, this was a nightmare, a terror that defied all reason. But to me, it was truth, the only truth that mattered. The truth of the forest, of the force that moved through all living things, consuming them, changing them. The force that had remade me in its image. I stepped forward, my hand outstretched. "Come," I said, my voice a whisper that carried the weight of centuries. "Come and be one with the eternal green. Come and feed the hunger that never dies." The Rangers recoiled, terror etched on their faces. They raised their weapons, their fingers trembling on the triggers. But it was futile, a gesture of defiance as meaningless as a candle before a hurricane. I felt the forest surge through me, its power crackling in my veins. The air shimmered, and the Rangers' weapons turned to dust in their hands, crumbling away like dead leaves. They stared at their empty palms, their eyes wide with disbelief and dawning horror. I reached out, my fingers brushing the cheek of the nearest Ranger. He shuddered at my touch, his skin blistering, peeling away to reveal the green beneath. The forest was claiming him, as it had claimed me, as it claimed all who ventured into its domain. One by one, I touched them, and one by one they changed, their bodies warping, twisting into new forms. They screamed, but their screams turned to rustling whispers, to the creaking of branches and the groaning of ancient wood. In moments, it was done. Where 3 humans had stood, now there were 3 trees, their branches reaching towards the night sky, their roots burrowing deep into the loam. They had been consumed, subsumed, made part of the eternal forest. I stood amidst them, feeling the pulse of the forest, the thrum of its ancient power. I was its child, its servant, and its instrument. Through me, it would grow, it would spread, until all the world was one vast primeval wood. The boots gathered around me, awaiting my command. I turned, facing the depths of the forest, feeling its call in my bones. There was much work to be done, much hunger to be sated. I stepped into the darkness, the boots marching behind me, and the forest swallowed us whole, welcoming us into its timeless embrace. As I moved through the forest, the trees parted before me like loyal subjects bowing to their king. I could feel their reverence, their recognition of the power that now dwelled within me. I was part of them, and they were part of me, all of us woven into the vast, primordial tapestry of the forest. To understand the profound change I had undergone, it's important to grasp the true nature of the forest. This was no ordinary woodland, no simple collection of trees and plants and animals. It was a living entity, a being of immense power and ancient hunger. Imagine, if you will, a vast interconnected web of life, where every root and branch and leaf is but a cell in a greater organism. That is the forest. It thinks, it feels, it hungers, and it grows, always seeking to expand its domain. For centuries, perhaps longer, It has lured creatures into its depths, consuming them, absorbing their essence into itself. In this way, it learns, it adapts, it evolves. The boots, the undead soldiers, even the very trees themselves, all are extensions of its will, tools it uses to feed its endless appetite. And now, I had become one such tool. By burying me in its soil, by infusing me with its essence, the forest had remade me, transformed me into a being uniquely suited to serve its needs. I was no longer fully human, but neither was I fully tree. I was something in between, a hybrid creature bridging the gap between the world of flesh and the realm of root and branch. But the transformation went beyond the physical. My mind, my very thoughts, were now intertwined with the forest's own vast ancient consciousness. I could hear its whispers, feel its desires pulsing through me like sap through a tree's veins. And what it desired, above all else, was to grow, to spread, to consume. That was the purpose it had imprinted upon me, the sacred mission I was now compelled to fulfill. It's a difficult concept for the human mind to grasp, the idea of an individual being subsumed by a greater, inhuman intelligence. The closest analogy I can offer is that of a hive mind, where the needs of the colony override the desires of the individual. I was still me, still retained my memories and personality, but my goals, my drives, were now aligned with those of the forest. As I walked, I pondered the implications of my new existence. I had been granted power beyond human comprehension, the strength of an ancient oak, the resilience of a hardy weed, the ability to shape and control the very plants around me. But that power came with a price, a responsibility to use it in service of the forest's aims. I knew that I would bring more into the fold, lure more humans into the forest's embrace to be transformed as I had been. In this way, the forest would spread, its influence creeping outward like vines overtaking an abandoned building. And perhaps, in time, all the world would be subsumed, all of humanity converted into servants of the eternal green. The thought filled me with a strange mix of awe and horror, of reverence and revulsion. But I banished such concerns from my mind. They were human worries, human fears, and I was human no longer. I was a child of the forest now, and my only concern was to do its bidding. The boots marched behind me, a silent, eerie procession. They were my army now, the forest's army, and together, we would bring more into the fold. The forest would grow, and the world would change. Such was the inevitable cycle, the unstoppable march of root and soil. I walked on, deeper into the green, feeling the forest's power thrumming through me with every step. I had found my purpose, my place in the vast eternal web of life. I was home, and I would make it my mission to bring others home as well. To the forest, to the eternal green. As I walked deeper into the forest, I felt a strange sense of peace settle over me. The transformation was complete. I was one with the ancient woods now, a part of something far greater and more powerful than my human self could have ever conceived. It's hard to put into words the profound sense of belonging I felt, the deep connection to the living, breathing entity that was the forest. Imagine every cell in your body singing in perfect harmony, every thought and impulse aligned towards a single unified purpose. That's what it was like, a complete merging of self with the vast primordial consciousness of the woods. The forest's thoughts flowed through me like a deep underground river, carrying with them the wisdom of eons. I saw flashes of the countless beings it had absorbed over the centuries. Animals, plants, humans, all of them now part of the great, interconnected web of life that sprawled beneath the ancient canopy. I understood now that the forest wasn't malevolent, wasn't evil in the way a human might understand the concept. It was simply following its nature, enacting the role that had been imprinted into the very fabric of its being. Just as a wolf hunts to feed its pack, the forest consumed to grow, to spread, to fulfill the imperative coded into its deepest roots. And now, that imperative was my imperative. The boots marched behind me, a tangible manifestation of the forest's will. Together, we would bring more into the fold, expand the forest's domain until it encompassed all the world. I emerged from the trees into a wide clearing. The night sky stretched overhead, the stars cold and distant. They seemed so small now, so insignificant compared to the vast teeming life of the forest. In the center of the clearing, I could sense them. More humans, their life forces flickering like tiny candles in the dark. They were camped for the night, unaware of the fate that awaited them. I approached silently, the boots fanning out behind me. The humans stirred, some primal instinct alerting them to the presence of a predator. They rose, peering into the darkness, their eyes wide with fear. I stepped into the light of their campfire, and I heard their gasps of shock, of terror. They saw me, saw the inhuman creature I had become, and they recoiled. But I felt no anger towards them, no hatred. They were simply ignorant, blind to the true nature of the world around them. They couldn't understand the glory of the forest, the beauty of the eternal cycle of life and death and rebirth. I would make them understand. I would show them the truth, just as it had been shown to me. I raised my hand, and the forest responded. Vines burst from the earth, wrapping around the humans, lifting them into the air. They struggled, they screamed, but it was futile. The forest was too strong, its will too inexorable. One by one, I touched them, and one by one, they changed. Their flesh hardened into bark, their limbs elongated into branches. They became part of the forest, part of the never-ending cycle. As the last of them transformed, I felt a surge of satisfaction, of fulfillment. This was my purpose, my sacred duty. I would continue this work, continue to grow the forest, until all the world was green and verdant and eternal. I turned back towards the trees, back towards the heart of the living woods. The boots fell in behind me, an endless procession, a silent army of the forest. I knew there would be challenges ahead, knew that humanity would resist the coming change. They would fight, they would struggle, just as I had struggled. But in the end, it would make no difference. The forest was patient, and it was inevitable. It would wait, it would grow, and in the fullness of time, it would prevail. I was the forest's instrument, its emissary and its avatar, and I would not rest until its great work was complete, until the whole world was remade in the image of the eternal green. With a final glance at the stars above, I stepped back into the embrace of the living woods, letting the ancient trees enfold me. I was home. And I would bring all of humanity home, to the forest, to the never-ending cycle of life and growth and change. It was my destiny, the forest's destiny, and nothing would stand in our way. The summer of 2018 was supposed to be my sanctuary. At 15, I had carefully planned 7 weeks of sleeping until noon, playing video games, and avoiding any form of structured activity. But my parents had other ideas. Camp Riverside, they called it. A week-long outdoor experience that promised character building and lifelong friendships. The brochure showed smiling teenagers around campfires, but all I could see was a prison sentence. "You're going, and that's final," my mother declared, her voice carrying that tone I knew better than to argue with. My younger brother Danny seemed thrilled about the prospect, bouncing around the kitchen like an overexcited puppy. At 13, he still believed adventures were fun rather than elaborate forms of torture designed by adults. The drive to the camp felt like a funeral procession. Rolling hills gave way to dense forest, and with each mile, the cellular signal bars on my phone decreased until they disappeared entirely. My stomach churned with a mixture of anxiety and genuine dread. Something about the approaching woods felt wrong, though I couldn't articulate why. The trees seemed to lean inward over the narrow road, creating a tunnel of shadows that swallowed our car. When we finally arrived at Camp Riverside, the place looked exactly like every horror movie camp I'd ever seen. Weathered wooden buildings scattered across a clearing, their paint peeling and roofs sagging. A lake stretched behind the main lodge, its surface unnaturally still and dark. Even the other arriving families seemed subdued, parents hurrying through goodbyes as if eager to escape. The registration process unfolded in the main lodge, a cavernous building that smelled of mold, old wood, and something else I couldn't identify, something organic and unpleasant. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows that made everyone's faces look gaunt and sickly. My parents signed papers with uncomfortable speed, avoiding my pleading looks. "It'll be good for you," my father muttered, but his eyes wouldn't meet mine. Even Danny seemed less enthusiastic now, clinging closer to our mother's side as we received our cabin assignments and daily schedules. The counselors moved through the crowd with forced cheerfulness, their smiles too wide and too persistent. They wore matching polo shirts in an aggressive shade of orange that hurt to look at directly. Something about their synchronized movements and identical expressions reminded me of cult members I'd seen in documentaries. When my parents finally left, their car disappearing into the tree line, I felt a profound sense of abandonment. The other campers and I stood in awkward clusters, suddenly aware that we were trapped here together for the next 7 days. The counselors herded us toward our assigned cabins like cattle, their voices echoing artificially cheerful instructions that seemed to bounce strangely off the surrounding trees. The path to the cabins wound through sections of forest where the canopy blocked most of the sunlight. Patches of moss covered the ground in unnatural patterns, and the air felt thick and difficult to breathe. Other campers walked ahead and behind me, but their conversations seemed muffled, as if heard through water. I was assigned to Cabin 7, a structure that looked like it predated modern building codes by several decades. The wooden steps creaked ominously under my weight, and the screen door hung slightly askew on its hinges. Inside, the air felt stagnant and oppressive, carrying the lingering odors of countless previous occupants. Our counselor introduced himself as Pete, a college-aged guy with nervous energy and constantly darting eyes. He spoke too quickly, as if rushing through a script he'd memorized but didn't quite believe. "Welcome to your home away from home," he announced, gesturing at the 6 narrow bunks arranged along the walls. "I know you'll all become great friends." The other boys filtered in gradually. There was Gerard, a pale kid from the suburbs who immediately claimed the bottom bunk nearest the door. Jerome brought enough electronics to power a small city, though he discovered quickly that none of them worked in this digital dead zone. Carson arrived last, carrying a single small duffel bag and wearing an expression of resigned misery that matched my own. As we arranged our belongings and attempted awkward introductions, I noticed troubling details about our accommodations. The windows had been painted shut, probably years ago. Dark stains marked the ceiling in patterns that suggested chronic water damage. Most unsettling, several of the floorboards felt soft and spongy underfoot, as if the wood was rotting from within. Pete led us through an icebreaker game that involved sharing embarrassing childhood stories and favorite foods. The forced intimacy felt violating, and I noticed that everyone's laughter sounded hollow and strained. We were all performing the role of happy camper while feeling anything but happy. Dinner was served in the lodge's dining hall, a vast room filled with long wooden tables scarred by decades of use. The food tasted like institutional cafeteria fare, overcooked, underseasoned, and vaguely suspicious in origin. Conversations echoed strangely in the high-ceilinged space, creating a constant background murmur that made individual words difficult to distinguish. That first night, sleep came reluctantly. The cabin's unfamiliar sounds kept me alert. Timbers settling, wind through gaps in the walls, and soft scratching noises that might have been mice or tree branches. Every time I began to drift off, some new sound would jolt me back to consciousness. My bunkmates seemed to fall asleep easily enough, their breathing gradually synchronizing into a rhythm that somehow felt unnatural. Pete had retired to his small counselor's room at the cabin's far end, and occasional snores confirmed his presence. Yet I felt utterly alone. Around midnight, I became aware of sounds outside the cabin. Footsteps moved through the camp, but they seemed wrong somehow. Too measured, too purposeful for a midnight bathroom run. I pressed my face to the painted window, trying to peer through the small gap where the paint had chipped, but saw only darkness. The scratching sounds intensified as the night progressed, seeming to move along the cabin's exterior walls. At one point, I was certain I heard something trying the door handle, turning it slowly and deliberately. But when I finally worked up the courage to investigate, I found the door securely latched from the inside. By morning, I was exhausted and on edge. The other boys seemed refreshed and cheerful, chattering about the day's planned activities as if they'd slept perfectly. Pete appeared with his usual manic energy, announcing a full schedule of hiking, swimming, and team-building exercises. I wanted to tell someone about the night sounds, but the words stuck in my throat. How could I explain that something felt fundamentally wrong about this place? The second day passed in a blur of mandatory fun, capture the flag, rope climbing, and group sing-alongs around the fire pit. I went through the motions while feeling increasingly disconnected from everything around me. The other campers' enthusiasm seemed artificial, their laughter timing perfectly with the counselor's jokes in ways that felt rehearsed. That evening, exhaustion finally overcame my anxiety. I fell asleep quickly, sinking into my sleeping bag like a stone dropping into deep water. But what happened next defied every rational explanation I could construct. I dreamed I was trapped in my sleeping bag in the middle of dense forest. Towering trees surrounded me on all sides, their branches interwoven so thickly overhead that no starlight penetrated. The air felt humid and heavy, filled with the rich scent of decomposing leaves, and something else, something sweet and sick that made my stomach turn. When I woke, I knew immediately that I was awake. The dream's hazy quality had vanished, replaced by sharp, clear consciousness. But my surroundings hadn't changed. Trees still surrounded me, their bark rough and real beneath my trembling fingers. Forest floor pressed against my sleeping bag. Damp earth, scattered leaves, the occasional protruding root. Terror flooded through me as I reached out desperately, trying to make sense of what was happening. My hands encountered solid cabin walls exactly where they should be, but my eyes saw only wilderness. The contradiction made my brain feel like it was tearing apart at the seams. I groped frantically for my digital watch, my only anchor to reality. When I finally found it and pressed the button, its small screen flared to life, illuminating a tiny circle of the cabin's interior. The artificial light seemed to punch through whatever held me, and suddenly I was back in the cabin completely. Walls, ceiling, sleeping bunkmates, everything normal. But the terror remained. I couldn't stop shaking, couldn't quiet my panicked breathing. The experience felt more real than reality itself, and the transition back had been too abrupt, too complete. I began hyperventilating, making strangled noises that finally woke the others. Gerard flicked on the overhead light, squinting against the sudden brightness. "What's wrong with you?" he mumbled, his voice thick with sleep and irritation. The other boys sat up in their bunks, staring at me with expressions ranging from concern to annoyance. I tried to explain what had happened, but the words came out jumbled and incoherent. How could I describe experiencing two completely different realities simultaneously? How could I make them understand that I'd been both in the cabin and lost in the forest at the same time? "It was just a nightmare," Jerome said dismissively, already settling back into his pillow. "Everyone has weird dreams the first few nights at camp." But Pete's reaction troubled me more than the others' dismissal. He watched me with an intensity that felt almost clinical, as if he was cataloging my responses for some unseen purpose. "Sometimes the mind plays tricks on us when we're in new environments," he said carefully. "The important thing is that you're safe now." The way he emphasized "now" sent fresh waves of anxiety through me. By morning, I could tell that my reputation among the other campers had been permanently damaged. They spoke around me rather than to me, their conversations dying whenever I approached. I had become the cabin's unstable element, the weird kid who couldn't handle a simple camping experience. The isolation made everything worse. With no one to talk to about what had happened, the experience replayed constantly in my mind, gaining weight and significance with each mental repetition. I began questioning my own sanity, wondering if the stress of being away from home had somehow triggered a psychological break. The next morning brought a mandatory hike to an activity building deeper in the forest. Our group gathered at the trailhead, where Pete delivered a briefing about staying together and following marked paths. The trail wound through sections of woods so dense that walking felt like moving through a green tunnel. I was near the middle of our group when I first saw her, a girl in a white dress standing motionless beside the trail about 30 yards ahead. She appeared to be around my age, but something about her posture and stillness felt utterly wrong. She didn't react to our approaching group, didn't turn her head or acknowledge our presence in any way. "Do you see that girl?" I whispered to Carson, who was walking beside me. He followed my gaze and shrugged. "What girl?" The closer we got, the more details I could make out, yet somehow the less real she seemed. Her dress was old-fashioned, with long sleeves and a high collar that belonged to a different era. Her skin had a waxy, translucent quality that reminded me of museum mannequins. Most disturbing, she cast no shadow despite the bright morning sunlight filtering through the trees. As our group drew within 10 feet of where she stood, she simply faded away. Not quickly or dramatically, but gradually, like morning mist dissolving in sunlight. One moment she was there, the next only empty air occupied the space. But that was only the beginning. As we continued along the trail, more children appeared at irregular intervals. A boy in suspenders and knickers stood on a fallen log, his mouth open as if he'd been calling out when time stopped. Twin girls in matching pinafores sat on a boulder, their hands folded identically in their laps, their eyes following our movement with mechanical precision. Each figure was perfectly detailed, yet fundamentally unreal. Each faded as we approached, dissolving into nothingness while my companions chatted and laughed as if nothing was happening. I began to question whether I was experiencing some kind of ongoing psychotic break, but the visions felt too consistent, too deliberately placed to be random hallucinations. The trail ended at a rustic building that served as the camp's arts and crafts center. From the outside, it looked normal enough: log construction, a metal roof, windows reflecting the surrounding forest. But as our group approached the entrance, I saw something that made my breath catch in my throat. The doorway wasn't filled with the bright interior lighting I expected. Instead, a mass of absolute darkness occupied the entrance. Not shadow or dim lighting, but genuine absence of light that seemed to absorb and cancel out the sunlight around it. The darkness had texture and weight, swirling slowly like thick smoke while maintaining perfect opacity. Pete and the other campers walked directly into this wall of blackness without hesitation, disappearing completely as they crossed the threshold. I could hear their voices continuing conversations from somewhere beyond the darkness, but seeing them vanish into what looked like a portal to nowhere filled me with paralyzing terror. I stood frozen at the building's entrance while the darkness shifted and writhed before me. Occasionally, I thought I saw shapes moving within it. Not my fellow campers, but other forms that moved with disturbing non-human fluidity. The temperature around the doorway felt noticeably colder, and the air carried a metallic taste that made my mouth water unpleasantly. "Come on in," Pete's voice called from somewhere beyond the black barrier. "We're waiting for you." But I couldn't move. Every instinct screamed that crossing that threshold would be catastrophically wrong, that whatever lay beyond wasn't the innocent craft building it pretended to be. I backed away slowly, my heart hammering against my ribs. Just as with the other strange visions, the darkness eventually began to fade. It dissolved gradually, revealing the building's normal, well-lit interior, where my group sat around tables covered with art supplies. They looked up at me expectantly, as if I'd simply been taking my time to enter. "Everything okay?" Pete asked, but his eyes held that same clinical observation I'd noticed before. I nodded mutely and took my assigned seat, but I couldn't concentrate on the pottery project we were supposed to complete. My hands shook too badly to shape the clay, and I kept glancing toward the doorway, half expecting the darkness to return. The remaining days at camp passed in a haze of anxiety and confusion. I experienced no more dramatic episodes, but the sense that reality was fundamentally unstable never left me. Every shadow seemed too deep, every sound too sharp or too muffled. I felt like I was living in a place where the normal rules of physics and perception could be suspended without warning. When my parents finally arrived to pick us up, I wanted to tell them everything that had happened. But looking at their expectant faces, ready to hear about my character-building adventure, I realized that some experiences are too strange to share. The camp had marked me in ways I was only beginning to understand, leaving me with questions about the nature of reality that I'm still trying to answer years later. Even now, I sometimes wake in the middle of the night, uncertain whether I'm in my own bed or lost somewhere in those dark woods, reaching out to touch familiar walls while my eyes see only trees. The summer of 2019 changed everything for me. I was 15 then, eager to attend what seemed like the perfect summer camp. Pine Ridge Safety Camp promised adventure, learning, and unforgettable memories. Located deep in the Oregon wilderness, surrounded by dense forests and isolated from civilization, the camp specialized in teaching teenagers essential survival and safety skills. My parents had enrolled me after hearing about the program's stellar reputation. Real police officers would train us, firefighters would demonstrate rescue techniques, and we'd even witness emergency helicopter demonstrations. The brochure showed smiling teenagers learning CPR, practicing wilderness navigation, and building confidence through challenging outdoor activities. The first week exceeded my expectations. Officer Rodriguez taught us self-defense techniques, while Sergeant Mitchell demonstrated proper emergency response protocols. The helicopter arrival was spectacular. A massive rescue chopper landing in the center of our camp, its rotors creating a windstorm that bent the surrounding trees. The pilot, Captain Stevens, showed us the intricate rescue equipment and explained life-saving procedures. My cabin mates were friendly enough. Ryan, a quiet kid from Portland, Danny, an energetic 14-year-old from Seattle, and Jerome, a tall, lanky boy who seemed perpetually nervous. We shared stories, played cards, and bonded over our shared excitement about the camp's activities. The counselors maintained strict schedules. Lights out at 10:30 p.m. sharp, with bathroom visits supervised after 10 p.m. Our cabin leader, Brandon, was a former military man in his early 20s who took safety protocols seriously. He'd patrol the cabin area regularly, ensuring we followed all rules and stayed within designated boundaries. But even during those first pleasant days, I noticed something unsettling about the camp's atmosphere after dark. The woods seemed to press closer to our cabins, and strange sounds would echo through the forest. Not animal sounds, but something else entirely. The other campers dismissed my concerns, attributing them to typical wilderness noises and my overactive imagination. By the second week, our nightly routine had become mechanical. After evening activities and campfire stories, we'd return to our cabins for personal hygiene and preparation for bed. The bathroom facility was a separate building, approximately 50 yards from our cabin, connected by a dimly lit gravel path. The bathroom building itself was unnerving. Built in the 1960s, it featured concrete walls, fluorescent lighting that flickered intermittently, and a constant musty smell that seemed to seep from the very foundation. The main area contained 6 sinks with cracked mirrors, while the back section housed shower stalls and toilet facilities. The building's design created multiple blind spots and acoustic dead zones where sounds seemed to disappear entirely. That particular Tuesday night, August 13th, I was running late for the bathroom routine. While my cabin mates had already completed their preparations, I had been delayed by a lengthy phone call with my parents. Brandon granted me permission to visit the bathroom facility but warned me to be quick and return directly to the cabin. Ryan and Danny decided to accompany me, claiming they needed to brush their teeth again. Jerome opted to stay behind, already nestled in his sleeping bag and complaining of a headache. Looking back, I wonder if Jerome sensed something the rest of us couldn't. Some primal instinct warning him to stay away from that building that night. The walk to the bathroom felt different than usual. The camp's outdoor lighting seemed dimmer, casting longer shadows between the buildings. Our footsteps on the gravel path sounded unnaturally loud, echoing off the surrounding structures. Even the typical forest sounds, crickets, rustling leaves, distant owl calls, seemed muted, as if nature itself was holding back. Inside the bathroom, the fluorescent lights buzzed more aggressively than normal, creating an unsettling strobe effect. The mirrors reflected our faces strangely, making us appear older and more haggard than we actually were. Danny commented on the unusual silence, noting that even the building's ventilation system seemed to have stopped working. As I stood at the sink, mechanically brushing my teeth, I became aware of an unusual sound emanating from the shower area. Initially, I assumed it was water pipes settling, or perhaps the old building's ventilation system malfunctioning. But as I continued listening, the sound took on a more disturbing quality. It was singing, definitely human singing, coming from the shower stalls. The voice was deep, masculine, and carried an eerily melodic quality that seemed to reverberate off the concrete walls. The song itself was unrecognizable, not any tune I'd ever heard before. The words were indistinct, almost mumbled, but the melody was clear and deeply unsettling. What made the situation particularly disturbing was the complete absence of running water. The shower area had been officially closed for maintenance since the previous day, with yellow caution tape blocking the entrance. No legitimate reason existed for anyone to be in that section of the building, especially not at this hour. Ryan and Danny had noticed the singing, too. We exchanged concerned glances in the cracked mirror, our toothbrushes suspended mid-motion. The singing continued, sometimes growing louder, sometimes fading to barely audible whispers. The voice seemed to move between the shower stalls, suggesting the person was walking back and forth in the restricted area. "Maybe it's just someone who didn't know about the maintenance closure," Danny whispered, though his voice lacked conviction. We all knew the camp's strict protocols about restricted areas, and any counselor or staff member would have been informed about the shower closure. The singing took on a more disturbing quality, repetitive phrases that seemed to loop endlessly. The voice would hit certain notes that made our teeth ache, frequencies that seemed to vibrate through our bones. It was as if whoever was singing knew exactly how to create the most unsettling acoustic effects in that concrete space. Ryan, typically the bravest among us, decided to investigate. Against my better judgment, I followed him toward the shower area, while Danny remained frozen at the sink, his face pale with fear. Ryan approached the shower entrance with cautious steps, his sneakers squeaking against the damp concrete floor. The yellow caution tape had been torn down, hanging in strips from the doorframe like grotesque party streamers. The singing continued, now clearly coming from the farthest shower stall, echoing off the walls with an almost supernatural resonance. When Ryan peered around the entrance, his reaction was immediate and terrifying. He jumped backward with such force that he nearly knocked me over, his face drained of all color. His mouth opened and closed soundlessly, as if he were trying to scream but couldn't produce any sound. His eyes remained fixed on the shower entrance, wide with genuine terror. "What did you see?" I demanded, grabbing his arm. Ryan's entire body was trembling, and he seemed unable to form coherent words. He just pointed toward the shower entrance, his hand shaking violently. Driven by morbid curiosity and the need to understand what had terrified my friend so completely, I stepped toward the entrance myself. The singing had stopped abruptly, replaced by an oppressive silence that seemed to press against my eardrums. The shower area was darker than the main bathroom, with only 2 functioning lights casting harsh shadows between the stalls. What I saw will forever be burned into my memory. In the farthest shower stall stood a man, completely motionless. He was wearing nothing but stained boxer shorts, his body unnaturally pale and seemingly malnourished. His hair was long and unkempt, hanging in greasy strands over his face. But what terrified me most was his posture. He stood perfectly still, facing the wall, his arms hanging limply at his sides. The man didn't respond to our presence. He didn't turn around, didn't acknowledge us in any way. He simply stood there, like a grotesque statue, completely motionless. The silence stretched for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. Then, without warning, he began singing again. The same haunting melody, but now it seemed to come from everywhere at once, bouncing off the walls and ceiling. I stumbled backward, my heart racing. This wasn't a counselor or maintenance worker. This was a stranger, an intruder who had somehow entered our supposedly secure camp. The implications were terrifying. If this man could enter the bathroom facility undetected, what else might he be capable of? Ryan and I ran from the bathroom facility as if our lives depended on it. Our feet pounded against the gravel path, sending stones flying in all directions. Danny, who had witnessed our panicked exit, abandoned his position at the sink and followed us into the night without question. Behind us, the singing continued, now seeming to follow us through the darkness. We burst through our cabin door with such force that it slammed against the wall, startling Jerome awake. The sound of our panicked breathing filled the small space as we struggled to catch our breath and process what we had witnessed. Brandon, who had been reviewing the next day's schedule at his desk, immediately sensed something was seriously wrong. "What happened?" he demanded, rising from his chair. His military training was evident in his immediate alertness and the way he quickly assessed our frightened state. Ryan was still too shaken to speak coherently. He sat on his bunk, staring at the floor and occasionally glancing toward the cabin door as if expecting something to follow us. Danny kept looking out the window, his face pressed against the glass, watching the bathroom facility in the distance. I forced myself to explain what we had encountered, describing the unauthorized singing, the man in the shower, and his disturbing motionless stance. Brandon listened intently, his expression growing increasingly serious as I provided more details about the intruder's appearance and behavior. "Stay here," Brandon ordered, grabbing his radio and a flashlight from his desk. "Lock the door behind me and don't open it for anyone except me or another counselor you recognize." He also retrieved something from his locked desk drawer. I caught a glimpse of what appeared to be a security device, though I couldn't identify it specifically. As Brandon prepared to leave, Jerome finally spoke up. "I heard the singing too," he admitted quietly. "I thought I was imagining it, but it's been going on for the past 3 nights. Always around this time. Always from the bathroom building." This revelation sent a new wave of terror through our group. If the intruder had been present for multiple nights, it meant our camp's security had been compromised for days without anyone in authority knowing about it. Brandon left the cabin with grim determination, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness as he approached the bathroom facility. From our cabin window, we watched his progress, our faces pressed against the glass like frightened children. The singing had stopped completely, and the camp seemed unnaturally quiet. When Brandon reached the bathroom building, he paused at the entrance, apparently listening for any sounds from inside. We could see him speaking into his radio, likely calling for backup or reporting the situation to the camp administration. After several minutes, he entered the building, his flashlight beam visible through the windows as he moved through the interior. The waiting was unbearable. Every shadow seemed to move, every sound from outside made us jump. Danny had armed himself with a baseball bat from the cabin's sports equipment, while Ryan sat on his bed, still trembling and occasionally muttering fragments of what he had witnessed. After what felt like an eternity, Brandon emerged from the bathroom building. Even from a distance, we could see his confusion and concern. He was speaking animatedly into his radio, gesturing toward the building and occasionally looking around the surrounding area as if searching for something. When Brandon returned to our cabin, his expression was troubled. "I need to tell you what I found," he said, his voice carrying a weight that made us all lean forward attentively. There was no one in the bathroom building. No one at all. We stared at him in disbelief. "But we saw him," I protested. "He was standing in the shower stall singing. We all heard it." Brandon nodded grimly. "I found evidence that someone had been there recently. The shower area showed signs of occupancy, wet footprints, disturbed dust patterns, and..." He paused, seeming reluctant to continue. "And there was a small tape recorder hidden in the back shower stall. It was playing a recording of someone singing." The implications hit us immediately. Someone had deliberately placed that recording device, intending to create exactly the kind of terror we had experienced. But that didn't explain the physical presence we had witnessed, the man standing motionless in the shower. Brandon's discovery triggered an immediate camp-wide security alert. Within minutes, our cabin was surrounded by flashlight beams as counselors and staff members conducted a thorough search of the entire facility. The camp director, Mr. Patterson, arrived with several police officers who had been participating in the camp's training program. We were questioned extensively about our experience, with each of us providing detailed accounts of what we had witnessed. The police officers took our statements seriously, treating the incident as a potential security breach rather than a teenage prank or misunderstanding. The tape recorder was placed deliberately, Officer Rodriguez explained to us. Someone wanted to create fear and confusion, but we need to understand how they gained access to the facility and whether they're still on the premises. The entire camp was placed under lockdown. No one was allowed to leave their cabins without escort, and additional security measures were implemented immediately. Police officers patrolled the grounds with trained dogs, searching for any signs of the intruder or evidence of how they had entered the camp. Despite the increased security presence, I found rest impossible that night. Every sound from outside made my heart race, and I kept replaying the image of the motionless man in the shower. The tape recorder explanation didn't account for the physical presence we had witnessed, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we had encountered something far more dangerous than a simple prankster. Ryan remained in a state of shock, refusing to discuss what he had seen in detail. Danny stayed awake all night, keeping watch at the window and occasionally reporting suspicious shadows or movements to Brandon. Jerome, who had initially seemed the most nervous among us, now appeared strangely calm, as if the confirmation of his fears had brought him some form of relief. The investigation continued through the night, with search teams combing every building and trail within a 2-mile radius of the camp. Despite their thorough efforts, no trace of the intruder was found. The following morning brought disturbing revelations about our camp's recent history. Mr. Patterson called an emergency assembly, where he addressed the entire camp about the previous night's incident. His words carried a weight that suggested he knew more than he was initially willing to share. We've discovered that similar incidents have occurred at other camps in this region over the past 2 years, he announced. An individual or individuals have been targeting youth camps, using psychological terror tactics to frighten campers and staff. The police investigation revealed that the intruder had sophisticated knowledge of the camp's layout and security protocols. The tape recorder had been professionally concealed, and the timing of its activation suggested careful planning and observation of our nightly routines. What disturbed me most was Officer Rodriguez's private conversation with Brandon, which I partially overheard. The intruder's methods matched a pattern of incidents that had escalated over time. At other camps, the initial psychological tactics had been followed by more direct confrontations and, in one case, an actual physical assault. We believe he's been watching this camp for weeks, Officer Rodriguez explained to the assembled counselors. He knows your routines, your security gaps, and your campers' behaviors. This wasn't a random intrusion. It was a carefully planned psychological attack. The camp's administration decided to continue operations with enhanced security measures, but many parents chose to withdraw their children immediately. Ryan's parents arrived that afternoon, and I watched as they drove away, Ryan's face pale and haunted in the back seat. Danny's family made the same decision, leaving Jerome and me among the few campers who remained. The final weeks of camp were overshadowed by constant vigilance and fear. Additional security personnel were hired, and our movements were strictly monitored. The bathroom facility was permanently closed, with temporary facilities installed closer to the cabin areas. But the psychological damage was done. Even with increased security, I felt constantly watched. Every shadow seemed to hide a threat. Every unexpected sound made me jump. The man in the shower had achieved his goal. He had stolen our sense of safety and replaced it with persistent, gnawing fear. Years later, I still think about that night and wonder who he was and what motivated him to terrorize children. The incident taught me that true horror doesn't require supernatural elements. Sometimes the most frightening monsters are the ones that walk among us, wearing human faces and carrying human malice. The experience changed my perspective on safety and trust. I learned that even in supposedly secure environments, supervised by responsible adults and protected by established protocols, danger can still find a way to intrude. That lesson, learned at 15 in a concrete bathroom facility surrounded by Oregon wilderness, has stayed with me ever since. Sometimes, in quiet moments, I still hear echoes of that haunting melody, and I'm reminded that some experiences leave marks that never fully heal. The man in the shower may have disappeared into the night, but the terror he created continues to resonate, a reminder that evil can appear anywhere at any time, wearing the most ordinary of faces.